Russia once promised the T-14 Armata would revolutionize modern warfare. It was supposed to be a super tank that terrified NATO, humiliated the West, and dominated the battlefield. But nearly a decade later, the T-14 hasn't shown up in Ukraine, not meaningfully and certainly not effectively. Instead of breaking Ukrainian lines, it's been breaking down in Red Square. So how did Russia's most advanced tank become little more than a running joke? First, let's delve into what made Soviet tanks so successful for nearly half a century. Soviet tank design was an astonishingly simple yet effective premise built around three core principles: mass production, battlefield effectiveness, and logistical simplicity. Starting with the legendary T-34 during World War II, Soviet tanks prioritized what military theorists call the firepower protection mobility triangle, but with a distinctly Russian twist. Where Western tank designers often sought to maximize individual vehicle capability, Soviet engineers optimized for what they could build in enormous quantities. To quote the Center for Strategic and International Studies, quantity has a quality all of its own. And the numbers here are what matter. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was described as the most prolific tank producer in history. The T-54-55 series alone saw over 100,000 units produced worldwide, making it the most numerous tank design ever created. This was followed by a successful implementation of the T-64 with its autoloader system to simplify usage and remove in-battle reloads. The T-64 and its successors, the T-72 and T-80, were built in numbers of upwards of 44,000. That's close to 150,000 tanks produced over 5 decades. Soviet design prioritized standardization across generations. The T-54, 62, 72, 80, and even the T-90 all shared similar size profiles, weight classes, keeping the basic model at 35 to 45 tons, and basic layout concepts, even if offensive and defensive capabilities drastically shifted. This meant that crews could transition between platforms with minimal retraining, some spare parts remained interchangeable across decades, and production lines could be streamlined to fit more models without significant overhauls. Secondly, the Soviets prioritized firepower advancement over other considerations. They consistently fielded larger guns than NATO counterparts, moving from 100mm on the T-54 to 115mm on the T-62, then 125mm on the T-64 and beyond. They pioneered smooth-bore tank guns, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds, and autoloader systems. NATO would eventually adopt all of these advancements, and with far greater effectiveness and performance. But the West was caught in a loop of perfecting the technology for years to ensure it was as precise and reliable as possible. The Soviet Union countered that with sheer numbers. If it could throw enough tanks at the enemy, it would be able to delay an opponent's advance or make headway into enemy territory. Thirdly, Soviet tanks were designed for the specific operational environment they would face. Low profiles would reduce target signatures, wide tracks would handle the plentiful Russian mud and snow, and massive dozer blades would flatten defensive earthworks. These weren't luxury features but practical solutions to the challenges of Eastern European warfare. Most importantly, Soviet tanks were designed to be operated by conscript armies with limited training time and diverse linguistic backgrounds. Controls were standardized, maintenance procedures were simplified, and complex systems were avoided in favor of robust, repairable solutions that could be understood by 18-year-old farm boys from across the vast Soviet Union. Enter the T-14 Armata, and all of this doctrine gets thrown out of the window. Instead of a 40-ton simple tank that could be mass-produced by the thousands, Russia designed a 55-ton vehicle that requires advanced electronics, sophisticated software, and manufacturing precision. These special features brought a host of potential benefits, but also contributed to the design's downfall. Take the unmanned turret concept, which is the T-14's signature feature. Traditional tanks place the crew in direct contact with their weapon systems. Yes, this made the turret a significantly more vulnerable place to be in when opposing tanks and artillery would target it first. But it also made the gunner significantly more in control of the systems that loaded, primed, and shot each round from the gun. The autoloader on the T-64 and later versions would also take some of the manual work away and drastically improve the theoretical fire rate. Instead, a T-14's crew is isolated in their protected capsule below the turret. Therefore, the whole tank depends entirely on electronic systems for situational awareness and weapon control. When these systems work, they provide capabilities that would, in theory, exceed Western designs. But when they fail, the tank becomes an expensive hunk of metal with 3 men trapped inside it. And since no plan survives first contact with the enemy, electronic systems are likely the first to go when the entire modern premise of warfare hinges on electronic warfare and denial. Additionally, the turret presents yet another potential point of failure: sight mismatch. With a traditional manned turret, the gunner is physically turned to face what the turret is pointing at. But in an unmanned turret like the T-14, the entire targeting and firing system is done remotely from the control shell below the turret. and while the turret can rotate freely around its base, the entire tank is much less maneuverable. If the visual systems on the turret stop working or fail to send real-time data to the gunner's screen, the tank is effectively running blind. A T-72's gunner could acquire and engage targets using purely optical sights, even when all electronic systems were disabled. The T-14's gunner, dependent on digital displays and electronic targeting systems, becomes helpless when these systems are jammed or damaged. And when the system needs to cross the barrier between the turning turret base to go from the turret to the monitor, it just adds another place where the system can break. Perhaps most embarrassingly, the T-14's combat effectiveness depends on software systems that are notorious for unpredictable failures under stress conditions. Modern military vehicles contain millions of lines of code controlling everything from engine management to weapon systems, and this software can fail in ways that no amount of armor can protect against. Remember the parade in the Red Square we mentioned at the beginning of the video? Well, it's famous not just for the appearance of the vaunted T-14, but also for what happened to the T-14 during rehearsals for the parade. To put it bluntly, during the 2015 parade rehearsal, the T-14 appeared to break down in Red Square, just stopped cold. Russian officials later claimed it was simply an inexperienced driver engaging the emergency brake or even a staged demonstration of the evacuation system. But the incident highlighted the fundamental difference between mechanical failures that can be quickly diagnosed and fixed, and electronic failures that may require specialized diagnostic equipment and software patches. In combat conditions where vehicles face shock, vibration, electromagnetic interference, and extreme temperatures, software failures could also be features rather than bugs. A T-72 with mechanical control systems can continue operating even when multiple components are damaged. A T-14 with a critical software failure becomes a 55-ton target instead. But beyond simple technical points of failure, Russian logistics and doctrinal downfalls were what led to the drastic underdelivery of the tank, starting with the T-14's production timeline. When Uralvagonzavod, Russia's largest tank manufacturer, unveiled the Armata platform during the parade, they didn't just promise a new tank. The chassis of the tank was supposed to be the base of an entire range of armored vehicles, from the T-14 tank and the T-15 infantry support vehicle to the T-16 battlefield recovery vehicle and the 2S-35 self-propelled artillery analog, despite the parade models of the 2S-35 using a T-90-derived chassis. The initial commitment suggested that 2,300 T-14 tanks would be delivered between 2015 and 20, enough to replace approximately half of Russia's frontline armored units, which would mean that Russia would build at least 400 tanks per year while still producing its older models for domestic replacement and foreign export. But not only has Russia failed to produce 2,300 tanks, it has managed to complete fewer than 20 test vehicles as of 2025, 5 years after the initial deadline. That's less than 1% of promised deliveries. Suddenly, the same officials who guaranteed mass production were making excuses about technical challenges and marketing conditions. The excuses became increasingly creative and contradictory. Previously, Deputy Prime Minister Yuris Borisov claimed that there was no need to mass produce the Armata. According to him, if the existing armored vehicles, in particular the updated T-72, were inferior to a potential enemy, we would promote the purchase of new weapons, but they are not inferior, which means there is no need to buy something. This represented a stunning admission that Russia's revolutionary tank offered no meaningful advantage over Soviet-era designs that were already decades old by that point. But the real reasons for this production catastrophe run much deeper than official explanations suggest. First and foremost, the T-14 program has been systematically looted by the same corruption networks that plague all major Russian defense projects. For years, over 72,000 Russian officials have faced corruption charges. This is practically a whole criminal enterprise masquerading as a government. Defense procurement, with its massive budgets and limited oversight, has become a particular target for this systematic theft. The T-14 program, with its multi-billion-dollar budget and an ever-extending timeline due to the aforementioned lack of rush, could have provided perfect cover for large-scale embezzlement. Design contracts were reportedly inflated, component specifications may have been manipulated to favor connected suppliers, and production milestones repeatedly missed, all consistent with the broader patterns of corruption that plague Russia's defense sector. Even more fundamentally, Russia's newer designs are completely dependent on foreign technology for advanced military systems. The tank's sophisticated fire control systems, thermal imaging, advanced armor materials, and electronic warfare capabilities all require components that Russia can't manufacture domestically. This is in complete turnabout from the Soviet designs, which are available to pretty much every former Soviet country in some capacity, as Ukraine has been updating the T-64, 72, and 80 on its own. During the period when the T-14 was being designed, Russia could still access advanced components through legitimate commercial channels. French thermal imaging systems, German precision electronics, and Western and Taiwanese semiconductor technology flowed freely into the Russian defense programs, allowing engineers to design systems that incorporated the best available technology at the time. Sanctions following Russia's annexation of Crimea began restricting this access, but the invasion of Ukraine created a complete technological blockade. Suddenly, the advanced components that the T-14 required for basic functionality became available only through significant markups from the black market, or were even unavailable entirely, forcing Russian engineers to either abandon key capabilities or attempt to develop domestic alternatives that simply don't exist. And the T-14 is plagued by yet another problem: lack of international interest. For a lot of military equipment, export sales are supposed to offset development costs and justify large-scale production runs. Russian officials predicted that countries that already import Russian tanks would switch over to the new model if they simply cut off the lifeline and maintenance support for the old ones. Instead, potential customers have either lost interest in Russian designs entirely or have developed their own alternatives. India, historically one of Russia's largest customers for the T-72 and T-90, has explored domestic tank production with its Arjun tank, but the program has faced serious setbacks, prompting continued reliance on Russian T-90s. China, which might have been interested in T-14 technology, has developed its own advanced tank programs that equal or exceed Russian capabilities. And other countries simply cannot justify spending $3 to $4 million per tank when existing alternatives cost a fraction of that amount and are already widely integrated into their national armies. Belarus and Kazakhstan, traditional customers for Russian armor, have continued ordering upgrades to existing Soviet-era platforms rather than investing in entirely new systems. This export failure also creates a vicious cycle that makes mass production economically impossible. Without large international orders to spread development costs across thousands of units, the per-vehicle price becomes prohibitively expensive even for the Russian military. But without domestic orders large enough to achieve production economies of scale, export prices will remain too high to attract international customers. In fact, the cited $3 to $4 million price tag is also likely an underestimate. A Russian military analyst previously suggested that the real cost of a tank might be as high as $8 million, double the initial estimate, which would make it among the most expensive such systems in the world. And this was 7 years ago, before skyrocketing Russian inflation, which would increase the costs further. But this doesn't quite answer why the tank has been virtually non-existent in the war in Ukraine, or at least in the same capacities that the scale of the war would suggest. For that, we have to consider the fact that the entire tank was over-engineered for the war Russia is currently fighting. The T-14 Armata was designed to fight NATO tank formations in large-scale conventional warfare or defend perimeters from offensive fire. But the Ukraine conflict evolved into a drone-saturated environment where even the most sophisticated armor could be a liability. When Russian engineers designed the T-14's protective systems, they optimized for threats that made sense in 2010. Anti-tank missiles like the Javelin, tank-fired APFSDS rounds, and artillery strikes. The Afghan Active Protection System was specifically designed to defeat these high-value, sophisticated threats that cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per shot. But the war in Ukraine saw both sides pioneer something that tank designers never anticipated: mass swarm attacks using FPV drones that can cost as little as $700 and over $10,000 to outfit with an anti-tank mine. These small, agile aircraft could be produced by the thousands and deployed in coordinated attacks that overwhelm even the most sophisticated defense systems. When you're facing dozens of incoming threats simultaneously, it doesn't matter if your active protection system can defeat individual missiles. The enemy will simply drop a mine on you from above, then keep doing it until they hit the right part, like the chassis entry port. The economic mathematics of this engagement are devastating for expensive armor. A single T-14 Armata costs approximately $4 million to build and deploy to early 2010 numbers. Ukrainian forces can purchase well over 4,000 FPV drones for the same amount in 2025. Even if the tank's defensive systems achieve a 90% kill rate against incoming drones, it's still losing an investment of only $100,000. More importantly, drone warfare fundamentally changed the concept of safe distance that tank operations depend on. Traditional tank doctrine assumed that armored vehicles could engage threats at ranges where enemy infantry could not effectively respond. Modern FPV drones can be operated from 3 to 12 miles away, with more advanced models reaching into traditional artillery ranges of 9 to 12 miles and more, meaning that tank crews never know where threats are originating from or how many are en route. And the T-14's sophisticated camouflage and stealth systems were designed for an era when military forces relied on radar and heat signature imaging from central, stationary targets or vehicles that would leave the same amount of trail behind. But the war in Ukraine introduced real-time surveillance using cheap commercial drone technology, bolstered by a rapid evolution of artificial intelligence, inflated government spending, and an utter democratization of Ukraine's manufacturers to implement technological advancements across the field. Sensors that detect heat, radar, or emissions work just as well when they're on a small flying drone, but are much more difficult to spot and counter when the drone is a dot hundreds of feet in the air. This persistent surveillance also eliminates the T-14's long-range engagement capability. The tank's advanced fire control systems and precision ammunition were designed to engage targets beyond conventional Western tank engagement ranges. But when every shot is being observed and recorded in real time, long-range fire simply provides targeting data. Perhaps most damning is the simple economic arithmetic that makes deploying T-14s in Ukraine a catastrophically bad decision for Russian forces. Considering the inflation-adjusted cost of $6 million on the original estimated figure, each T-14 lost in combat represents the equivalent of 6 modernized T-72B3 tanks that could provide similar battlefield capability, thousands of FPV drones that could destroy multiple enemy armor units, around 170 Zala Lancet loitering munitions with proven anti-armor effectiveness, enough artillery ammunition to sustain a battalion-level operation for weeks. This is further compounded by the fact that Russia hasn't produced more than 20 T-14s. This puts the actual cost of each tank astronomically high, and the next version won't be much cheaper. So the few T-14s that exist have become assets so valuable that they cannot be risked in actual combat, making them militarily useless despite their theoretical capabilities. In fact, Sergei Chemezov, head of Rostec, which owns Uralvagonzavod, has noted that the Russian government itself has no interest in procuring more T-14s after the initial test batch. With existing Soviet-era tanks, which would cost tens of thousands of dollars to outfit to be operational in Ukraine, still in storage, there's no need to spend millions on a new tank if both models just end up doing the same thing. The T-14's complexity also creates maintenance requirements that current Russian military logistics simply cannot support under wartime conditions. Traditional Soviet tanks were designed to be maintained by conscript crews using basic tools and standard spare parts. The T-72's reputation for reliability stems partly from this design philosophy. Systems were deliberately over-engineered to function even when improperly maintained, and critical components could be repaired or replaced by soldiers with limited technical training. The T-14 requires the kind of sophisticated maintenance infrastructure that exists only in major military depots with specialized facilities and highly trained personnel. If minor electronic failures can render the tank inoperable until it can be transported to rear area maintenance facilities, it's practically useless in a field where electronic warfare is a part of daily life. This puts another strain on Russian army planners, namely how to protect the tanks from breaking down through lack of support. Tank units equipped with T-14s would require extensive logistical support just to maintain basic operational readiness. This means they'd need steady supply lines running from factories to the front line. Those same supply lines and factories have been frequent targets of Ukrainian attacks, and putting a part of the manufacturing process farther from the front doesn't work either, as Ukraine has been able to devastate an airfield that houses Russian nuclear bombers located 2,700 miles away. The T-14 Armata represents everything wrong with Putin's approach to military modernization and Russia's broader strategic miscalculations. When you examine the tank's development timeline, production failures, and general absence from actual combat, you're looking at a microcosm of Russia's entire defense industrial complex. Grandiose promises backed by insufficient resources, technological ambitions constrained by sanctions and corruption, and propaganda requirements that prioritize appearance over actual capability. But maybe the Russian T-14 Armata does have the best stealth system in existence, since it hasn't been seen on the front line in Ukraine. And that's telling you everything you need to know about the current Russian regime. After years of catastrophic armor losses, the T-72s and T-80s being destroyed daily, Russia still won't risk deploying its supposedly superior T-14s. This suggests that even Russian commanders understand that their multi-million-dollar super tank would likely share the fate of every other armored vehicle that entered the drone-saturated Ukrainian battlefield. And when you're fighting a war that's already left around 1 million soldiers killed or wounded, it raises questions when you're still not deploying the most advanced conventional tank you own. Thank you for watching, and if you want to take a deep dive into some other failed Russian military endeavors, subscribe to The Military Show.